participate.
He's ready. He's ready.
Yep.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lynn Coudet. I'm the membership chairman for the Historical Society. And we love having guests, and we have some guests in the back, Jan and Dean, who are here for their second time. They were here last week as well. So this is our last program for the summer here at Vail Headquarters. Does somebody know something otherwise? So as far as I know, our next program will be the fourth Monday of September at the History Center. So our speaker this evening is Mindy Johnson.
I'll have something to say.
He has something to say.
Also, last week, Sherry Kroll, our president, made the announcement that this year's dinner for the holiday dinner is going to be on November 11th on Veterans Day. It's going to be held at 1 o'clock at Wilson Creek Winery. Wilson Creek Winery, 1 o'clock on November 11th. Also, I've had 40 members, people sign up for the trip going up to Nate Harrison Ranch on September 22nd. So if anyone else is here tonight, I think Bonnie wasn't here last week. Is anybody else? I think most of you are here last week to know about it. Also, some people were asking me about how you're going to pay for the luncheon that's going to be up there. It's going to be a catered lunch, $20 a person. It's going to include salads, and it's going to include your main course and a dessert and your drink. It's going to be it's going to be fish and chicken will be on the menu. So it's going to be a nice luncheon up there. And I recommend if you have a Jeep or a truck to drive that instead of your car. Cars will naturally make it up there. But if you have one of those, it might be beneficial for you to drive that. There's a couple of potholes. It's a county road that's maintained, but it has a couple of issues because of COVID. So it's just a word up. Also for luncheon, you pay Vicki Morgan up there. She's the owner of the property, and you can pay by check, money order, or cash. Some people have asked me how we're going to pay for lunch.
Credit card?
Credit card also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, credit card also?
Credit card, check, or cash. And we're also going to have a docent named Seth Malaz. He was the director of archaeology up there. So it should be a fun tour. I hope you all enjoy it. September 22nd. We'll meet at the Red Barn at 8:30. I'll have directions. It's very easy to find. It's only about, 18.5, 23 miles. 13 and 5 is 18. Once you get to 76 and to 15, it's only about 18 miles. So it's not that far. An easy drive. We should be there by, we'll leave at 8:30. We should be there by 9:15. Okay?
Are we going up from the bottom or down from the top?
Okay.
Question.
Any more questions?
Somebody else almost wants to take it, wants to sign up. She's not here, but she wants to sign up.
Oh, okay.
Our speaker this evening is Mindy Johnson, and Mindy was born and raised in Riverside, California. She attended the University of California, Irvine, where she majored in linguistics. She's married, and she has a daughter and a son. And Mindy enjoys reading, traveling, and doing volunteer work and singing. I never knew about the singing. Several years ago, I was contacted by a family member of Annie Bergman, and they thought that her grandchildren, thought that she would be a good person as a notable woman of Temecula. Mindy and I went to Aguanga, where they lived, and we met with two of their children and their spouses at their home in Aguanga. They provided the history and photographs as well as most of the narrative for Mindy's talk about Annie Bergman. So Mindy's very first presentation was given at the History Center, and it was on a Sunday afternoon. Nearly 50 of Annie's descendants attended the program to hear about Annie's life. No pressure there. So it went very well, and we're very happy to be able to present Annie Bergman.
Just kidding.
Adjust the volume once you.
Check, test, test. How's the sound? Good?
Great.
In the back? Yeah. Awesome. Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Lynn. Good evening, everyone. There is a binder kind of going through the crowd, white binder, and it's got family photos of Annie and her parents and her husband and kids and various things. And hopefully they're captioned okay, just for you to look at. And the other thing, in case I forget, please remind me at the end of my talk to tell you a fun fact I recently discovered. All right, well, this is the story of Annie Edith Esther Mendenhall Bergman. It is a frontier story, a love story, and a story of resilience. It is a remarkable life story. Before I go on, is everyone here familiar with the communities of Aguanga and Oak Grove? I know we have some new members. Anyone not know where they are? Okay. Okay, great. You know, take Highway 79 that direction and you'll get to them. Okay, great. Well, Annie Mendenhall was born September 10th, 1895 on Palomar Mountain. She was the youngest of 6 children, 4 boys, 2 girls. Her parents, Sylvester Jacob and Annie Morris Mendenhall, owned a ranch on Palomar Mountain and raised Angus cattle. First, I want to give you some background about her grandparents and her parents. Her paternal grandfather, Enos Thomas Mendenhall, better known as Enos T., was born in 1822 in North Carolina. He was a descendant of Quakers who had come to North America with William Penn in the 1600s. While a young man, his parents moved to Indiana, where he became a school teacher. In 1847, he joined the Llewellyn wagon train headed for Oregon. Driving an ox team, he helped Henderson Llewellyn bring some of the first fruit trees, primarily apples, to the Willamette Valley. While in Oregon, he met and married Rachel Emily Mills, who also was born in North Carolina and descended from Quakers. They were married in March of 1848. In 1849, along with their now first child, Elvira, they moved first to San Francisco and then to the Sacramento area when the gold rush began. Enos T. and Rachel Emily built and operated hotels near Sacramento, Colfax, and Grass Valley. They had 8 more children, including the first recorded pioneer child born in the gold fields. That would have been George Mendenhall. Well, while in the gold fields, Enos T. joined a vigilante committee in an effort to control the crime that followed the gold rush. He became acquainted with Alonzo Horton and Sam Strickland, who were interested in settlement and development in San Diego County. Around 1870, at the request of Mr. Horton and Mr. Strickland, Enos T. came to San Diego. His 3 sons, George, Sylvester, and Dick, joined him in 1872. Enos T.'s wife, Rachel Emily, stayed in Colfax with their 4 daughters to run the family hotel and never came to Southern California. Enos T. made several trips back north to visit them each time trying to persuade his wife and daughters to come back with him. But she preferred to stay in Colfax, running the hotel and helping where needed as a midwife and a nurse. Well, when Enos T. first came to San Diego County, he homesteaded at Pine Mountain near Bear Valley, which is now known as Valley Center. Well, in the 1870s, there were cattle and horse rustlers operating on Palomar Mountain. It was an ideal refuge, being located between Mexico and Chino, a major horse trading center, with lush pastures, ample water, and remote location. What better place to hide stolen livestock? Well, remember I mentioned that Enos T. was good friends with Alonzo Horton? Mr. Horton's name familiar to anyone? Yeah? Okay. He was a real estate developer in San Diego in the late 19th century and a very important man there. Horton Plaza in downtown San Diego and some other places are named for him. Well, the story goes that Mr. Horton, knowing of his past work on the vigilante committees in the goldfields, sent Enos T. undercover to first find and then put a stop to the rustling on Palomar Mountain. The problem was, when the law came riding in looking for them, the rustlers seemed to know ahead of time and would send the stolen animals to some other valley on the mountain. So Enos T. started a pig farm as a cover on the Guajito land grant. He learned the pattern of the rustlers, then passed on the information to law enforcement, and eventually the rustlers were apprehended. Later, he secured a homestead of 160 acres on Palomar Mountain in what was called the Malava Valley, later changed to the Mendenhall Valley. And he began his cattle ranching. Well, to give you an idea where Mendenhall Valley is located, if you're standing up at the Palomar Observatory, great talk last week, by the way, Dale, and you're facing south, Mendenhall Valley is below you on the left-hand side. So now we get to Enos T.'s second son, Sylvester Jacob, who would become Annie's father. He had left school at age 13 to help with the ranch. But later at age 24, he went back to school, enrolling at the College of the Pacific up in San Jose, attaining an education in surveying and engineering. When he returned to Palomar, he brought his new wife, Annie Elizabeth Morris. That's little Annie's mother. Well, Annie Elizabeth Morris Mendenhall was educated and had taught school in New York State, where she was born. She was a governess for 5 years in San Jose, which is where she had met Sylvester. They were married in 1883. Sylvester then filed for a homestead of 160 acres on Palomar Mountain in the area now known as Mendenhall Valley. In October of 1887, Sylvester and his father formed a partnership of their land. The ranch grew to more than 12,000 acres, earning the Mendenhalls the name Cattle Kings of Palomar. Well, little Annie was raised on this ranch. She would ride on horseback 2 miles to school. She rode behind her brother George. He was 2 years older. At times, he would reach back and gather up her legs and then make the horse trot, giving her a very bumpy ride. Does that sound like an older brother or what? Annie was a bright child. One of her favorite pastimes was reading up in the attic. One day she was reading the family Bible and noticed a list of all the children born, including their birth dates, written in it. She promptly added her name and birth date to the list. She was 5 years old when she did that. Later, at around age 6, her father made her go through all of his property tax bills and compare them with the assessor's parcel number with the legal documents, and to make sure that the information agreed. At 6 years old, wow. And by then, the ranch had grown to over 13,000 acres. Annie did not leave the mountain until she was 8 years old. When she started attending Palomar Mountain School, she was put in at the 3rd grade level. She was the youngest student and the only 3rd grader. She enjoyed school and was a hardworking student. When Annie was about 11, her father bought the Kuka Ranch below the Mendenhall Valley at the base of Palomar Mountain along the San Luis Rey River. Because the Mendenhall Ranch was above the snow line in the winter, having a pasture below the snow line was important. The cattle could be easily driven down the mountain in the fall and then back up in March or April. Even before a house could be built on the Kuka Ranch, the menfolk promised to help Annie Morris move down the mountain. It became obvious the men were not acting fast enough. So little Annie helped her mother pack up the household goods, tied the chickens' legs together and swung them over the back of the mule, and moved down the mountain themselves. When the family finally did settle, Sylvester built a big cement house that is still standing. The Mendenhall Valley Ranch, however, would still be considered their true home. When Annie was older, she attended Escondido Union High School and then went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which at that time was a boarding high school. She went to San Luis Obispo to be with her brother George. And in 1914, she graduated from there with a diploma in household arts. And later back in San Diego, she attended Kelsey Jenney Business School. I'm going to back up for just a minute and talk about an event that became a crucial part of Annie's life. In 1906, when she was 12 years old, a fire started in the valley and spread up Palomar Mountain. It burned much of the grazing land for the Mendenhall's cattle. After the fire was out, the cattle wandered down the mountain looking for food. After several months of free grazing, a young cowboy named Arlie Bergman and his father, Henry Bergman, drove the cattle back up to the Mendenhall property. Annie saw the 15-year-old Arlie and fell head over heels in love with him. And much to her chagrin, he didn't even notice her. And on top of that, when the cattle were brought back to the pasture, the Mendenhalls thought that the number of calves returned by the Bergmans was a little short. This would lead to some animosity between these two families. Well, this is a good time for me to introduce you to Arlie Bergman. He was born Orlando Bergman on July 7, 1892. His maternal grandmother suggested he go by the name Arlie, and he did from then on. He was the youngest of three, having an older sister and brother. Arlie's paternal grandparents were Jacob and Philippina Bergman. They had come to Aguanga in 1864. For the sum of $400, they bought a half interest in what was then known as the Mountain Ranch at the west end of the Aguanga Valley. 3 years later, in 1867, they bought the other half of the interest, and the ranch became known as the Bergman Ranch. Some background now on Jacob and Philippina. Jacob Bergman was born in Darmstadt, Germany, in the mid-1830s. He arrived in San Francisco in 1852. In August 1858, he enlisted in the Army at the Presidio in San Francisco. He served as a farrier, a horseshoer, in the cavalry. From 1859 to 1861, he was stationed at Fort Tejon, north of Los Angeles. Incidentally, if you ever drive the Grapevine on the 5, you'll pass historic Fort Tejon. And if you've never stopped there, it's worth taking a look at the building, as it's interesting. Well, sometime during his stay at Fort Tejon, he met Philippina Scherer, a fellow German emigre. They were married March 4th, 1860 in Los Angeles. His army unit then headed east to participate in the Civil War. In May 1862, he was wounded in the First Battle of Williamsburg, Virginia. 2 months later, he was honorably discharged from the Army. Reunited with Philippina, they moved to Yuma, Arizona, where Jacob took over the Butterfield Stagecoach Station. That's a familiar name here, huh? He carried the mail by mules and wagon to Los Angeles for a couple of years. When he and Filipina came to Aguanga in 1864, they had their one-year-old son, Henry, with them. And Henry would become Arlie's father. Jacob and Filipina would raise a total of 8 children on the Bergman Ranch. In October 1867, Jacob Bergman became a citizen of the United States. Besides farming and ranching, they bought, sold, and transported various goods. Beginning in 1869 and for many years after, he held the position of the local road supervisor. He opened the first post office in Aguanga in 1870 and served as postmaster for several years. Also in 1870, he was appointed Justice of the Peace for Temecula Township. In 1873, he was elected to the San Diego County Board of Supervisors, a position he held for 2 years. You can see Jacob was a very civic-minded man. And by the way, Jacob Bergman's name was the last to be carved in the giant granite rock titled "They Passed This Way," which stands in front of the Temecula Valley Museum in Old Town. So Jacob and Filipina's oldest son, Henry, was educated and sent to learn a trade. In 1877, 14-year-old Henry was in Temecula, perhaps apprenticing as a butcher. He helped drive the overland stage for his father in the 1880s, from Warner's Ranch to Colton. And on Easter Sunday, 1886, he married Alice Irene Godfrey, whom he had met at a masquerade party at a roller skating rink. Henry and Alice were Arlie's parents. Okay, back to Arlie. Growing up, Arlie helped his family on the ranch. His father leased land from the Cahuilla Indians for pasturage. Arlie grew up with the Cahuilla Indians and considered them friends. He was fluent in English and Spanish and spoke some Cahuilla. He also graduated from high school and business college. So we now have these 2 well-established families, the Bergmans down in Aguanga and the Mendenhalls up on Palomar Mountain. And in 1916, these 2 families were brought together again, this time by Annie and Arlie. But remember, the Mendenhalls still thought the Bergmans had shorted them of some of their calves after that fire in 1906. Well, the meeting of Annie and Arlie happened like this. Arlie, now age 21, was working for the Forest Service, installing telephone lines. He was working up on Palomar Mountain, where he saw Annie, who was now 18. This time, he was smitten, and her feelings for him had not changed. The trouble was, the 2 families still had a disagreement about some of the Mendenhall cattle on account of that fire 6 years previously. And Annie's big brothers did not take kindly to a Bergman courting their baby sister. So, Arlie went hunting and bagged several quail, which he used as a peace offering, presenting them to Annie's older brothers. While they were busy cleaning the quail, Arlie had time to pay court to Annie. Well, Annie and Arlie were married on February 10, 1917, at her parents' home in Escondido. Their honeymoon was spent on property they homesteaded in Lost Valley, near Warner Springs. As a wedding gift, Arlie gave Annie a Winchester rifle. Shortly after marrying, they acquired a 1/5 interest in the Mendenhall Cattle Company that belonged to Annie's family. The land consisted of 13,000 acres, of which Arlie and Annie had 1/5, or about 2,600 acres. Well, the uneasiness between the 2 families finally ended a few years later when Annie's brother Edmund, who was known as Hap, was captured and put in jail in Mexico. Hap had gone down across the border while chasing after some Mexicans who had stolen horses he was in charge of. Annie's other brothers wailed and moaned about what they were going to do, but then didn't do anything. Arlie saddled his horse and rode to Mexico. No one knows what happened, but when he returned, Hap was with him. After that, there was no bad blood between the families at all. Annie and Arlie continued the family tradition of raising cattle. Annie would ride with Arlie when caring for the animals. They also owned and operated a butchering business at their home in Aguanga. They continued to rent pasturage from the Cahuilla Indians. Branding and marking the cattle occurred in the corrals of the Cahuilla Reservation. Annie would prepare a hot meal and take it to the corrals for the helpers and family members at lunchtime. Annie also kept the ranch records. For most of her adult life, Annie kept a diary of business that included moving, buying, and selling of cattle. She kept records of buying hay and grain, the quantity bought, and at what price. She recorded almost everything that happened within the ranching business. And over time, the diary became a personal diary as well, where she wrote about her family and her travels. In the early 1930s, Annie drove a mail route from Aguanga Post Office to Oak Grove and Chihuahua Valley. In the earliest days, the mail vehicle was a Model T Ford. Now, the Model T did not have a fuel pump, so gasoline was fed into the engine by gravity flow. When the angle was wrong, the gas couldn't get to the engine. According to the stories, when she reached the hairpin turn on the Chihuahua Valley Road, after which there's a long uphill climb, Annie had to stop, put the car in reverse, and go up the hill backwards. When the children were small and not in school, they went with their mother on the mail run. Excuse me. Annie and Arlie had 5 children, although only 4 lived to adulthood. Their oldest son, Frank Lester, died in 1929 at age 11 of a childhood illness. Their other children were Ray Lester, Carl Henry, Esther Mary, and Walter Arlie. Well, as I just mentioned, one of the businesses of the ranch was a slaughterhouse. The meat was then taken to retail outlets and restaurants in the neighboring areas. And when the children were young, they would often come to the slaughterhouse on butchering days. There was a partition wall that they sat upon so that they could watch what was going on and not be in danger of getting hurt. Arlie would always alert the helpers ahead of time to mind their language if the children were going to be there. Growing up with Annie and Arlie was good. Their home was a solid, positive foundation. No quarrels, no loud voices raised in anger, no profanity. To catch Annie and Arlie in an embrace was to join them and get part of the hug. Friends and family just seemed to visit regularly and would join the family around their large table for a good meal prepared by Annie. Didn't matter how many people there were, she just took care of them. Well, the family took camping trips together. In 1927, they took the old Ford to Yosemite. In 1937, they took the family, as well as Arlie's mother, Alice, to see the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. 1941, it was a trip to the Carlsbad Caverns. In 1947, Arlie built a camper for his Hudson pickup for a weekend trip to Calexico and then a drive to the Oregon coast. Sadly, their family life, their happy family life, was forever changed by Arlie's sudden and tragic death. In January 1948, Arlie had bought a horse for a neighbor at an auction. Arlie worked with the horse for a while, and it seemed to be good. He was riding it, still working it out, when something spooked it and it reared up. Arlie was thrown from the saddle, but his foot caught in the tie rope. The horse galloped off, dragging Arlie through fences and over shrubs and rocks. An artery in his leg was cut, and he bled to death. He was 56 years old. Well, after Arlie's death, Annie took over running the ranch. Since they owned several thousand acres of land, it was up to Annie to run the business and make it profitable. Having a degree from a business school helped her to a great extent, as well as having the help of her big, strapping sons, who, by the way, always referred to their mother as the boss. Well, 2 years prior to Arlie's death in 1946, the Mendenhall Cattle Company had disbanded, leaving 5 shareholders. The corporation owned land in the Mendenhall Valley, Love Valley, at the top and the foot of Palomar Mountain. Annie was able to amicably figure out the distribution of the land between the shareholders. Annie got the top of Palomar Mountain as her part of dissolving the company. It was about 1,800 acres. Well, remember I mentioned the town of Oak Grove? Back in the 1930s, the former Oak Grove schoolhouse was no longer being used as a school. Instead, the building was used as a community center. Community dances, among other events, were held there. A community dance included people from all over the backcountry, from Hemet to Julian to Temecula and points beyond and in between. It was not unusual for a family to put the children in the car, include blankets and pillows to bed them down, and then drive for miles to the dance and come home in the morning having danced and visited all night. But by the early 1950s, it was evident that the old schoolhouse was worn out. A new building was started with all of the materials purchased by the community, who also furnished the labor. Well, the money started running short for buying windows and doors. Annie came up with the idea of printing the name of the person on the door or window who donated the money. Naturally, Annie Bergman's name was one of the first to be put on a window. The names of the donors were visible for many years. Thus, the Oak Grove Community Hall was built, and it served for many years as a center for dances, quilting bees, social events, and a general meeting place. As you can see, Annie was a central part of all the activity in her community. In 1950, at age 55, Annie decided to move away from the ranch to give more opportunities for her youngest son, Walter Arley, to get his schooling. For 3 years, they lived away from Aguanga, first in Paris and then in San Diego. Her oldest son, Ray, had already taken over the running of the ranch. Walter Arley was not happy living in the city and wanted to spend his time back at the ranch. So working with a friend named Charles Clark and another neighbor family, Annie was able to negotiate a three-way trade. She got the Aguanga General Store, post office, and gas station. The others got a house in San Diego and another property. So Annie became the Aguanga postmaster, general store manager, and gas station attendant all at the same time. But best of all, Walter Arley got to move back to the ranch. Well, while operating the store, Annie met a salesman for Levi Strauss Jeans Company. She befriended him and soon became a sales representative for Levi's Jeans herself. She priced the jeans in her store at $4.95 per pair. I know, yeah. When word got out that she had the best price on Levi's, people came from all over the area to buy jeans from her. Annie encouraged and promoted community involvement. She was clerk for the voting precinct for many years. Annie had been instrumental in promoting the community hall in Oak Grove financially, as well as getting people to come to it for various activities. And in 1859, the community held an official mortgage burning party at the hall. The debt for their community hall had been paid. Her love of handwork kept Annie busy with embroidery, crocheting, and tatting, and sewing. She was part of a quilting bee. She sewed clothes for herself and her daughter Esther, including Esther's bridal gown and 3 bridesmaid dresses. In 1963, the U.S. government filed a lawsuit demanding that they, the government, be paid for the water rights on all the land in the Aguanga Valley. Unlike many of her neighbors, Annie had the funds to hire an attorney to file the appropriate papers in response to the lawsuit. She then made copies of the paperwork to give to her neighbors so they could file before the deadline. Annie also acted as a private banker for people who could not get credit. She had a friend named Mabel Barnes. Mabel borrowed $4,000 from Annie to buy a rooming house in Imperial Valley. Mabel did not have a credit rating good enough to get the loan from a bank. Annie trusted her, and over time, Mabel paid back the entire loan. So you certainly get a sense of how committed Annie was for many years to her neighbors and to her community. Annie had always loved to travel, and she continued to travel well into her later years. In 1957, she attended a postmaster convention in Kentucky. In 1959, she bought an Ameripass and traveled around the country by bus. She went on a bus tour of the Canadian Rockies that year, too. She enjoyed listening to people she met on these bus trips. She was a great listener and knew what questions to ask to get people talking. In 1964, at age 69, Annie and her sister-in-law, Alice D. Bergman, traveled to several countries in South America. Later that year, Annie took a Linskog Pacific Circle tour to Japan, attending some of the Olympic Games in Tokyo. Is that sounding familiar? Yeah, that was when the Summer Games were last held before this summer. It was 1964 in Tokyo. Bit of a coincidence. The tour then went on to Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. She traveled twice to Oberammergau, Germany, thank you, Arnie, to see the Passion Plays, which were performed once every 10 years. In 1967, Annie took her most favorite trip with Linskog Friendly Tours to Africa. On the tour bus, she always sat up front near the driver and soon had him telling her all about himself. One driver even persuaded her to try eating termites. She loved staying up in the trees overlooking a water hole to see the animals come and go. She definitely had an adventurous spirit, and of course she loved talking to the people she met. Well, when she wasn't traveling, she enjoyed square dancing. In the 1960s and 70s, she had two gentleman dance partners to take her to the dances. Her daughter, Esther, made matching outfits for Annie and Annie's granddaughter, Carol, who sometimes went with her to the dances. Annie liked to say that she had lived, quote, from buggy whip to jets, unquote. And that is certainly true. Annie passed away June 25th, 1998, peacefully in her sleep in Hemet, California. She was 102 years old. I think you will agree that Annie was a remarkable woman, lived a very remarkable life. And thank you for letting me share her story with you. You have questions? Yes, Tom?
You said to remind.
Oh, yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, I have an interest in names, being a linguist, I guess. When I heard the Mendenhall family name, I couldn't help wondering if there might be a connection with the Mendenhall Glacier just outside of Juneau, Alaska. Has anybody taken a cruise up there and seen the glacier? Okay. Well, so first I went to wikipedia.com and I looked up the Mendenhall Glacier. The glacier, as well as the Mendenhall Valley, and there's a Mendenhall River, were given the Mendenhall name in 1891 in honor of Thomas Corwin Mendenhall. Well, then I had to look up Thomas Corwin Mendenhall, and he was a prominent physicist and meteorologist and a professor at the Ohio State University. Then I looked up Thomas Corwin Mendenhall on wikitree.com and was able to find the names of his ancestors. So then I looked up Enos T. Mendenhall on Wikitree, and again I was looking back at the names of his ancestors. I found that he and Thomas Corwin Mendenhall share the same fourth great-grandparents. So that would mean that Enos T. and Thomas Corwin were fifth cousins. So for Annie, she was a fifth cousin, twice removed, with Thomas Corwin Mendenhall. Ta-da! Thank you.
Grand lady. She could do it all.
Yeah. She, like the Energizer Bunny? You know, just wow. Yeah, really did a lot.
Traveling and cooking and
Dancing and,
stores.
yeah.
What about those houses, the adobe-looking houses down toward Anza? Now,
Okay.
they're supposed to be a Bergman houses or Bergman museum?
Those, couple different things you might be asking about. There is a Bergman museum. We drove past it.
Towards Anza.
Thank you. Yeah, towards Anza. When we went to the field trip at the museum in Anza. And I learned that that was a brother of, hang on. Henry Bergman had an older brother, Frank, and I believe it's Frank Bergman's opened that. It was like a museum or something for a long time.
We
It's
went
like a
in there
fruit
once.
stand now, but
Oh, okay.
I think it opened. They look adobe, and it's got like a dinosaur on the roof.
Yes.
And then down
Yes.
below, they both look really interesting. So
I've never been there because
Yeah, dinosaur stuff in there and fossils.
Yeah.
And
and
also,
then it was closed, I think,
closes
for a
and-
while
Yeah.
during COVID. But I've heard, yeah, it's back open
And then
again.
there's a
But-
graveyard out there. Or
Okay.
there's a-
Yes. The grave markers you can see from
Yeah.
79 are Jacob Bergman and his wife Philippina, and I believe one of their sons that died young.
now that Oak
Oak Grove.
Oak Grove?
Grove Community Center,
Yeah, it's-
is that the one you were talking about that's still there?
Yes, it is still there too. The building is still standing. I don't know what it's used
Yeah, we
for.
went to a pancake sale.
They
one
used
time.
to, they used to have every month. They had a yard sale, and you paid a certain amount, but that stopped with COVID, which was
Right,
too bad
right.
because you could buy hot dogs, and it was under the oak tree. It was nice, but it's not being used now. So
Mindy, I think it was the stage station at one time.
Yes, the Bergman Ranch
Well, no, the Oak Groves.
or the Oak Grove.
Yeah,
I believe you're right.
it was a stage
Yeah.
station one time, and you used to, on holidays, they would open it up like Memorial Day, 4th of July,
Okay.
and we took a tour. As events, we took a tour out there one time, and we met the owner. He was there for us.
Is that the one? It's on the if
basically
West side,
across.
if you're going
Yeah.
south, it's on the west.
it's on the west side,
Yeah.
right at the base of the mountain, at base of.
No, it's right opposite the community center in Oak Grove.
Oh! I'm thinking of a different place. Okay.
We talked about a
that's a
concrete
private
building.
owner then?
Yeah.
Right,
Where's
and
that?
the concrete building is the Cougar Ranch, which is on the other side of Palomar Mountain from
south
where
of
we
it.
are. Yeah, on the south side. I'm really hoping, because looking at it on a map, it looks like the road we will take to get to Nate Harrison's ranch goes past the Cougar Ranch. So I'm really hoping we might be able to see the building. I don't know anything about it. It's no longer in the family. I believe they sold it in the mid-50s. Funny. I'm glad you asked that question. The past few days I've been trading messages on Facebook with Betsy Bergman Chavez, who is a granddaughter of Annie and Arlie. She is the daughter of Carl Bergman, their second son, Carl Wog. Wog was his nickname. And I asked her because, with COVID happening and all that, I was wondering about the family members. And Annie's 4 children, they are all still living. They range in age from Ray, who is the oldest son. He's 100 years old now, and he lives in Montana. Esther lives outside Temecula. Her father, Carl, lives on Palomar, and he's 94. And Walter Arlie, the youngest, lives in Oak Grove. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.